BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Good evening and welcome live to a special edition of Tomorrow's World and the beginning of what will be an historic event in space. Tomorrow, after a 24-hour delay due to bad weather, these are the latest pictures from Cape Canaveral and it looks pretty miserable. It means that the Space Shuttle Atlantis should blast off at 9:43 in the evening, our time tomorrow. Its mission, to be the first American space shuttle to dock with the Russian space station Mir. It'll be a spectacular manoeuvre. The enormous shuttle was never designed to dock with the Russian space station, but if they're successful, the rendezvous will herald the official end of the space race. After 4 decades of fierce competition, the two rivals, America and Russia, will completely merge their space programs. I've been to Houston to follow NASA's preparations for this extraordinary mission and to talk to the shuttle crew who are about to set off on this momentous journey. British-born astronaut Mike Foale explains the challenge of docking 2 100-ton spaceships travelling at over 17,000 miles an hour. And we'll be looking at where this link-up might eventually lead. A giant international space station flying by the turn of the century.
And in Moscow, I've been on the inside of the Russian space program to find out what it is that makes NASA so keen to get its hands on Russian technology. At Star City, I take a tour of Space Station Mir with the first Briton in space, cosmonaut Helen Sharman. And from 200 miles above the Earth, we follow the preparations as Mir braces itself for the arrival of Atlantis.
But when the moment of docking arrives, NASA are saying Monday afternoon, the crew on Mir can only sit tight and wait. The real pressure is on the people flying Atlantis. In charge is Shuttle Commander Robert Hoot Gibson, making his 5th trip into space. He selected his own crew, and together they make up one of the most experienced teams ever to go into orbit. As well as 5 Americans, there are 2 Russian cosmonauts on board who will transfer to Mir after the docking. Well, getting the shuttle into position will mean a complex aerial ballet. If it comes in slightly too fast, or just a few inches offline, the consequences could be disastrous.
0.12 at 200 feet.
0.12. Yeah.
The crew have practiced dealing with all the different problems that could occur as they're trying to steer the 100-ton shuttle gently up to the Russian space station. But for ex-Top Gun pilot Hoot Gibson, this time the biggest challenge has been the language barrier.
I know how to say Yagoveru Paruski Ochim Ploha, which is I speak Russian real bad. I'm able to say We Gotovi, we're ready. We Segda Gotovi, we're always ready.
As well as the technical jargon they need to speak, for Hoot's number 2, Charlie Precor, it's also important to be able to share the joy of this unique encounter in space.
It's really such a fantastic experience. You hate to be looking out a window next to a person that you can't communicate with at all, to share just the magnificent experience that it is.
3, 2, 1... and liftoff.
In February, the shuttle flew up for a close approach to Mir on a practice run. There was no docking, but it gave NASA a chance to try out all the orbital maneuvers needed to catch up with the Russians. On board was British-born Lincolnshire lad Mike Foale.
Even at 100 miles, we started to see this very bright star hanging above the curve of the Earth, and it's the Mir.
Watching from the shuttle was a Russian cosmonaut who'd spent a year on Mir. Vladimir Titov was delighted.
And then all of a sudden, when we were being fairly quiet in the cockpit, Vladimir was going, blah, blah, blah. It's very voluble Russian, and very excited, and Vladimir's beaming away, and we hear the chatter on the VHF radio. And so this set the scene as we came on up to the approach.
But for the rehearsal, this was as close as they got.
Spasiba, you are very nice, and maybe someday we can meet.
This time, the shuttle will be equipped with a docking tube in the payload bay designed for mating with Mir. After launch, the shuttle will climb to a position about 300 feet below the Russians to begin the final approach. And there's no autopilot. By firing short bursts on its thrusters, the commander will fly the shuttle up to Mir by hand.
He's basically braking, and so what he does is as he sees it, he pulls back on his hand. And every time he pulls back, it's so that he feels he's slowing down as he approaches the station.
For the last few feet, to guide the commander in, there'll be a camera inside the shuttle's docking tube pointing at Mir, linked to a TV screen in the cockpit.
Looking through the window, he has a pretty good picture of where it should be. And he could probably fly this within 2 or 3 inches, just looking out the window. But to get it perfect, there is a crisscross on the TV screen. And he has to keep that lined up smack bang in the middle of that TV screen.
Finally, to stop Mir just bouncing off them when they touch, the shuttle has to accelerate hard.
They push a button in the cockpit that forces the shuttle to pick up speed, and it starts firing all its jets and goes bang, 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 and pushes together close. So it's quite a task, and he will be very quiet while he's doing that.
There'll be a short pause after the shuttle has nudged into Mir to allow for the two craft to stop wobbling about after the impact. Then it'll be time to move into the docking tube and float up to the Russians for the biggest party in space history.
We do not carry any alcohol at all on shuttles, and I honestly don't know what the Russians do. I've heard it alleged that the Russians have no vodka at all on board the space station, that it's all cognac.
No. Цветы,
flowers,
сок,
candies, juice.
We have jokes that say the Russians refuse to open the hatch unless you take some cognac and sprinkle it around the hatch so that they can smell it through the hatch seal, and then they'll open the hatch and let you in.
хлеб, соль.
Bread and salt.
Это по русскому обычаю.
According to the Russian custom.
Ну и, конечно, рукопожатие и объятия.
Handshaking and lots of hugs.
When Atlantis finally meets up with Mir, it will actually be the second time the Americans and the Russians will have met in space. Back in 1975, this Soviet Soyuz rendezvoused with America's last ever Apollo capsule. Astronaut Tom Stafford maneuvered the Apollo, while in the Russian Soyuz, Alexei Leonov looked on.
The best time of our program was situation when we opened hatch and I saw Tom Stafford. I said, Tom, hello, you my brother. You are welcome on board our spacecraft.
20 years passed without Russia and America meeting again in space. But in 1993, NASA's Dan Golden and Russian Yuri Kopchev signed the agreement that would end the space race.
It's a historic moment, and I'm just very excited. Mr. Kopchev, I want to give you a hug.
The beginning of a new relationship. And in March this year, astronaut Norman Thagard became the first American to ride a Russian rocket and float aboard the Mir space station to more hugs. Mir has been up in space, orbiting the Earth 16 times every day for 9 years now. It's the first space station designed to be extended in orbit. Over the years, 4 new modules, living areas or laboratories have been launched and successfully docked. Here inside Star City, the Russian cosmonaut training complex, they have this full-size working mock-up of Mir, which is the closest you're going to get to the real thing on Earth. There's only one British person who really knows what life is like on Mir, Helen Sharman. In 1991, she spent 6 days aboard the space station. Now she's back in Star City to give us an insider's guide to Mir. So this is Mir. I don't know, it looks somehow bigger.
Well, typically, I mean, 2 people will live on board the space station, although it can cope with 6 or even 7 at a push.
And how many of you were there?
There were 5 when I was there. Most of the social time would be spent here, yes. I mean, this is, apart from anything else, that you need to be near where the controls are if there's an emergency. What about eating and drinking? Here on the wall, through this valve here comes a particular measured dose of water, nice and sterile. You can pump this water into your dried packets of food. You wait a while for them to hydrate and you can eat them. You sort of squeeze your soup out of that. And a running machine as well, because you've got to make sure you're fastened down to it or you end up on the soup. Helen, I've got to ask you this. This is the toilet, OK? There's a cap on top of it just to keep it all enclosed. Everything's sucked away from the body with an airflow, because you can't even rely on gravity for that. Here's my bedroom. There are 2 of these on board the space station. My sleeping bag was actually fastened to the wall to stop you from actually floating off while you are asleep, if you like. You have a window. It's a glorious sight. And my last night in space, I was determined I was not going to go to sleep, because it was my last chance to actually look out at the Earth and out into space.
Life, even in space, can become routine. But the months before the docking have seen a lot of activity aboard the real space station. As the big day approaches, far from just sitting around and waiting, the crew have had a punishing schedule to get ready for the arrival and docking of Atlantis. The shuttle is due to dock here at the top, but these 2 solar panels are far too close for comfort. The Russians decided they had to be moved, and the only way to do that was to get outside with a spanner. Cosmonauts Strekalov and Dezhurov successfully retracted one of the panels, but then it refused to come off. And when they'd finally shifted it, they couldn't reattach it. Twice they reached the limit of their oxygen and returned to Mir exhausted and bruised. But finally, they succeeded in reattaching the rogue panel. Mir is now ready for the shuttle to dock. The Russians have far more experience in docking spacecraft than the Americans. The techniques for docking objects as large as Mir and Atlantis were developed by them back in the 80s for their own space shuttle called Buran.
2, 3. Поехали.
But Buran only flew once and didn't dock with anything. So here they're testing the machinery again and again to make sure that on the big day, nothing goes wrong. But however many times it's rehearsed on the ground, the only time that really matters will take place on Monday afternoon. While on Mir, all they can do is wait for Atlantis to emerge from the darkness.
Atlantis will be the first of 7 shuttle missions to Mir, and then once they've all got the hang of meeting up in orbit, the real work will begin on what will be the most ambitious project in space since putting a man on the moon, an international space station permanently manned by the year 2002.
It will be by far the biggest structure ever built in space, as long as a football pitch, constructed from individual units flown up and bolted together in orbit.
The Americans have built a mock-up of part of Space Station Alpha here in Houston. Once the shuttle has docked, this is the view that will greet the astronauts. I'm in what is known as Node 1. To my right is the European module.
It's one of 6 laboratory modules in the space station. Across the other side is the Japanese lab.
Because everyone will be weightless, there's no need for a floor to walk on. So all 4 walls can be used for storage and equipment. But it also means there's nothing to tell the astronauts which way's up and which way's down. So everything has to be marked and colour-coded.
Down behind is the US laboratory. Most of the scientific experiments in the station will, of course, take advantage of the zero-gravity conditions.
At the other end of the US lab module is Node 2, and down below is the habitation module.
The luxurious bathroom is somewhat different from conditions on Mir, which reminds me, we shouldn't forget about the folk who live at the far end of the corridor.
Behind there are the Russians. They haven't been included in the mock-up yet, but their modules will be the first into space, and they'll be some of the most important. For instance, they're supplying the tug which will keep the space station in orbit, as well as the lifeboats. In an emergency, it'll be 2 Soyuz capsules which ferry the crew back to Earth.
The fact that the space station Alpha relies on Russian hardware may at first seem a little odd. After all, haven't we been led to believe it was the Americans who won the space race? They were the ones who put man on the moon. They were the ones who launched the shuttle. They were the ones who made space sexy. The stories we hear these days about the Russian space program are all of decline, of bankruptcy, and of outdated hardware. But is it possible that our vision of the Russians is still blurred by Cold War rhetoric? Perhaps the Americans didn't win the space race, just the PR war. So what exactly do the Russians have to offer? Of course, they have history. Here in the secret museum of the main design bureau, their unique treasures testify to that. This is the actual capsule in which Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. Valentina Tereshkova's capsule, the first woman in space. And over here, Voskhod 2, the capsule from which cosmonaut Alexei Leonov made the first ever spacewalk. Space race? In the early days, it was a walkover. As well as the track record, they also have the hardware. This is the world's most successful spacecraft, Soyuz, which first flew in 1967. Now, it may look like a museum is where it belongs, but it was Soyuz that took Norman Thagard to Mir just a few months ago.
Americans have a nice saying. You have to be very clever to do simple things. In this room you see apparatus which may look primitive to you, but that is superficial outlook. This apparatus has changed inside quite a lot. Also, it's comparatively cheap, a really attractive characteristic.
Helen Sharman trained for her flights on Soyuz here at Star City. So this is the actual capsule you did your training in?
We spent a number of times actually sitting in here. Oh, a bit tight. 3 of us would actually fit in here.
And then all these control panels, which look slightly old-fashioned. How would you reach that?
You have a choice of either uncomfortably reaching up and leaning forward, or else you actually have use of one of these sticks, and you can actually then push whichever knob you require. The screen in the middle is one that was vital to us in the end. Through this, we would actually watch the space station approaching, and we could see the cross on the outside of the station that we had to line up with. And these knobs here are the actual manual controls by which we could move forwards and twist around and move our speed a little bit as well. I always reckon that these 2 seats are the best ones because they're the ones with the windows. And the first time you actually get to see out of this is during the launch. You've got just outside of the atmosphere, and that's when you're so far outside of the atmosphere you don't need the protective shield around the outside of the rocket anymore. You blow that away, and as soon as you blew this away, light streamed in through the window. My first view was of the Pacific Ocean, because that's already how far we'd gone from Kazakhstan eastwards.
The cosmonauts have to believe in their own equipment. But what do the Americans make of this Russian technology now they're allowed a closer look?
We're impressed with much of their technology. It's way ahead of the U.S. technology. Things that we've talked about doing, they've done. And a lot of people don't realize that. They think their vehicles are archaic. They've been using them for 20 years. But if something worked, they didn't abandon it. They reused it, improved it, and have kept things relatively simple that are complex.
But the Russians did have their failures. They too planned to go to the moon, but Neil Armstrong destroyed that dream in 1969. So they needed a new goal, and they decided the future lay in long-duration flights and space stations. They didn't want to visit space, they wanted to live there. For 20 years, the Russians have been methodically making themselves into the only players in the space station game. They cut their teeth on 7 Salyut stations, and the lessons they learned from those resulted in Mir. No one else has their experience. At Mission Control in Moscow, having cosmonauts in space is the norm. Cosmonaut Sergei Krikalev has spent well over a year up there, 4 times longer than any American. But the reason behind these long stays in space is not the pursuit of records. the Russians are already thinking far into the future.
We are going to build in future space station on different planets, on Moon, on Mars maybe. But we have to, as first step, to build space station, to have experience of long duration flight, to learn how walk in space, how live in space.
But Mir is beginning to show its age. So increasingly, the future of the Russian space program is now riding on the success of Alpha. And characteristically, the Russians aren't hanging around. Remember that lifeboat for Alpha? It's the Black Soyuz on this simulation. Well, here is the real thing. Here in the factory in Moscow, fresh off the production line, fully fitted and ready to fly. It appears that when building space stations, the Russians seem to have it all. The experience, the knowledge, the hardware. So look at it the other way. What do the Russians have to get from the Americans? Well, one answer is quite simple. Money. For the use of Mir in the present series of missions, they're getting $400 million.
Yes, and as well as paying the Russians for access to Mir, America will have to bankroll most of the planned International Space Station Alpha. And it won't be cheap. It's going to cost at least $20 billion to finish, so its future still hangs in the balance. In a special report for Tomorrow's World, Sam Roberts looks at whether the Americans can be persuaded to stump up the cash.
Here in the far south of the United States is the Boeing Corporation's giant rocket and spacecraft factory. In these ultra-clean, temperature-controlled hangars, the American modules of Space Station Alpha are already being constructed, painstakingly milled out of solid blocks of aluminium. In 2 years' time, astronauts will be looking out of this window onto the Earth over 200 miles below.
Well, that's the plan. But NASA has wanted to build a space station ever since the moon landings. These modules were in fact designed nearly 10 years ago for what was to be Space Station Freedom. Then 2 years ago, Freedom was abandoned, and now they're part of Space Station Alpha. But even though they've got this close, it still might not fly, because over the years, the politicians have steadily been losing patience with NASA and its grand schemes.
Back in the 60s, these very buildings where Space Station Alpha is now being constructed were used to assemble the giant moon rockets. In those days, NASA could do no wrong. The American government gave them whatever they wanted.
By the time the last Saturn V blasted off for the moon, NASA was already struggling to justify the enormous cost of getting into space. What they needed to keep the politicians happy was non-stop glorious moments. Instead, it's been one setback after another. First, the shuttle went massively over budget and then tragically exploded live on television. Then the Hubble Space Telescope had blurred vision. And it seems they've even had trouble getting the basics right, like the toilet.
This is the Extended Duration Orbiter Waste Collector System. This is a similar system that will be used in the space station.
This version of the Extended Duration Orbiter Waste Collection System, otherwise known as the Space Shuttle Toilet, was ordered up by NASA in the mid-80s. NASA originally estimated that it would cost $3 million, not cheap. But once work had begun, NASA ordered a redesign. And then a redesign of the redesign. The toilet finally ended up costing an astounding $24 million. And even then, on its first flight, there were problems. The only way to unblock it was by hand.
Close the lid, and then you're done. So when it comes to a multi-billion-dollar space station, Congress has been less than enthusiastic.
I love to walk on the moon and do a spacewalk. I would love to do that.
These kids have big dreams. The space station's promoters have been struggling to explain just what America would get for the money.
Some distant tomorrow. It's about life on Earth today.
So politically, the arrival of the Russians could change everything. This will end up being the most important feature of the space station.
It's where the Russian modules will connect. Joining up with the old enemy gives American politicians with no interest in space good reasons for supporting a space station. It soaks up Russian rocket designers who might otherwise end up working for countries like Iran. And it should stop the Russians undercutting American firms trying to launch satellites. Suddenly, the space station has new purpose. It's foreign policy in orbit.
So it seems things have come full circle. The threat of being shown up by the Russians made America build the giant Saturn rockets that went to the moon. Now the Russians may once again be the force that puts America into space.
Well, right now everything rests on the teams of Atlantis and Mir, and of course the weather. The one thing NASA can't control are the storms they're getting in Florida at the moment. Let's just hope they've cleared by tomorrow. Everything else has been rehearsed to perfection.
This thing says 80 feet now.
From the moment of launch, each step will have to be timed to perfection, so that the final approach happens when they're directly over a Russian ground station. Travelling through space at over 17,000 miles an hour, 1 second late and they'll miss by 5 miles. But even once they've joined up, there's one last thing that could go wrong with the Russian-built docking system.
What if they can't undock and the shuttle gets stuck to Mir? Well, whilst the Russians had included exploding bolts to cover that eventuality, the ever-cautious Americans needed to make absolutely sure, so the crew were sent into the tank.
Underwater is the closest they can get to simulating weightlessness. The crew have practiced undoing, one by one, a ring of small bolts that holds the docking tube together, and there are 97 of them.
We did the full scenario in the water, and it's a good 6 hours. We have power tools that will actually allow us to unscrew the bolts, but as it turns out, a number of the bolts are not captive. So when they come unscrewed, they'll keep going and drift off into space unless we capture them.
But even if it does come to this, there will be some consolation.
You know, when you're out there doing a spacewalk and you can have the opportunity to glance out of the corner of your eye and watch the Earth go by for a few seconds, you know, it makes it a pretty neat experience. So it's one that you want to extend rather than terminate early.
The Americans' elaborate preparations should mean that whatever happens, they will be able to pull away from the Russians at the end of the 5-day link-up, loop the loop and return to Earth. But for the two countries, this mission should mark the start of a permanent bond, a complete merging of the two space programs forever.
What I hope history looks back at is that we made the commitment to try to make it work, and that there will be high times and low times, and it will be hard. It's not an easy thing to do, but the fact that we will be remembered for having brought together these nations, that we formed a partnership, and that we stayed the course.
It really is going to be quite an event, and you'll be able to join us live as the story unfolds. Tomorrow's World has two special programmes this coming Monday when the rendezvous in space is due to take place. We'll keep you up to date with the very latest on the mission and bring you the breathtaking pictures from 200 miles above the Earth. And here in the studio, we'll have some of the greatest names from space exploration. Vladimir Titov, who's flown in the shuttle and spent time on Mir. Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space. Helen Sharman will be here, as well as Patrick Moore, and Mike Fole will be joining us live from Mission Control Houston. It's a superb team, and you'll be able to put your questions to them about this historic mission by phone, fax or over the internet. Details on CFAX page 623. The first of our programmes will be at 4:30 till 5 to 5, and then also at 11:40 until 12:30 midnight. We'll see you on Monday. Good night.